Hello and welcome to today's food history seminar. I'm Matt Philpott and I'm chairing this session. We also have Kelly here as one of the other conveners of the session. So today we have Joel Mead, who is a final year PhD student at the Department of History at the University of Liverpool. His research explores the history of eggs in Britain between 1942 and 1999, and part of which of that will be his subject of his talk today. So he's funded by the Northwest Social Science Doctoral Training Program and was recently awarded an RHS Centenary Fellowship in partnership with the Institute of Historical Research. So we've got a talk from Joel today. As per usual, please do feel free to put comments or questions into the chat. After the session is finished, we'll have plenty of time for questions as well, which either you can raise your hand or, as I say, put things into the chat. So without any further ado, Joel, I will hand over to you.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm just going to share my slides and then I'll crack on. Okay. Great. So hopefully everyone can see that now. Brilliant. Okay. So this paper's emerged out of my ongoing PhD research, which explores the history of egg production and consumption in Britain from the Second World War to the end of the 20th century, examining how eggs, an everyday, ordinary food, became deeply contested objects shaped by anxieties around health, class, gender, and modernity in Britain. The title of my paper is I'm Speaking for the Battery Hen, Chickens Lib and the Protest Against Battery Cages in Britain, 1971 to 1988. And it ends in 1988, just before the Salmonella scare kicked off. So that's that. I go into that in following chapters and happy to discuss in the questions if you like. And the paper explores opposition to the industrialization of egg production in Britain during the 1970s, focusing on the activist group Chickens Lib. So as can be seen in the leaflet on the right of the screen from 1973, Chickens Lib were asking, where have all the chickens gone? In the decades following the post-war period, urbanization and the decline of small mixed-use farms increasingly removed egg-laying hens from daily life, while advertising obscured the realities of modern agriculture. This paper explores how activists worked to make egg-producing chickens visible to urban consumers again, revealing broader anxieties about modernity. Their opposition reflected wider post-war concerns, from the decline of traditional rural practices to new health risks and moral uncertainty. So in the first part of the presentation, I'll take you on a whistle-stop tour of who Chickens Lib were and the socio-cultural context from which they emerged. I'll then delve into the source base for my research and situate the paper within the existing literature. The following section will focus on Chickens Lib's 1975 appearance on the BBC television programme Open Door, which encapsulated their core beliefs, namely opposition to battery egg production, distrust of the government's role, and the use of live battery hens in protests. The final section will examine Chickens Lib's direct action techniques and moral framework. Chickens Lib was unique in British animal welfare campaigning at the time, in that it brought the animals to the protest it organised and attended. Presenting real-life battery chickens at protests made the suffering of these animals visible to industry actors and urban consumers, literally bringing the rural hinterland into view. So who were Chickens Lib? They were founded in the early 1970s by mother and daughter Violet Spalding and Claire Druce to oppose battery cages, a method that by then had come to dominate egg production. So in this image, Violet's third from the left and Claire's the furthest on the right. Starting in London and later moving to South Yorkshire, the group was funded by donations, subscribers, and small grants. Adopting a multifaceted approach to activism, including letter writing and public demonstrations, lobbying, and media production, they argued that cages were cruel, unhealthy, and environmentally harmful. So they were originally called the Barnes Action Group, but Chickens Lib adopted its new name in August 1973 after a Fleet Street journalist dismissed the original as too boring. Notably, this came just months after the animal rights philosopher Peter Singer introduced the term animal liberation in the New York Review of Books in April 1973, and 3 years before the Animal Liberation Front adopted its name in 1976. But in her 2013 book, Claire Druce doesn't actually credit Singer as the inspiration. She instead links the name to public familiarity with the women's liberation movement. And that brings us into the 1970s, which marked the beginning of Britain's deindustrialization, a process that would accelerate dramatically into the 1980s. And at the same time, the decade saw a surge in social movements focused on gender, sexuality, race, and the environment. So the first Women's Liberation Conference and Gay Liberation Front meetings took place in 1970, and this coincided with a more outspoken RSPCA and a renewed energy within the campaign for nuclear disarmament. It was in this context that Chickens Lib emerged. Influenced by feminist and environmental thought, the group also drew on longer-standing moral discourses, rural traditions, anti-cruelty campaigns, and especially the anti-vivisection legacy. Chickens Lib highlighted the ethical and environmental costs of battery egg production, directly confronting how urban food consumption depended on distant, hidden rural systems. So as you can see from this graph, egg production transformed at an unprecedented pace and scale in Britain in the years following the Second World War. So prior to the war, most eggs in the UK were produced on small-scale mixed-use farms, with hens having regular access to the outdoors. Government incentives and technological developments rapidly reshaped British egg production after the war, favouring intensive methods like battery cages and large-scale monocultural sites. So you can see the rapid transformation of egg production here. Free-range methods dropped from 80% of production in 1951 to just 1% by 1980. And conversely, battery cages grew from 8% in 1951 to 95% by 1980. Chickens Lib were formed as a reaction to this transformation and its consequences. So the paper is primarily based on sources that I found in the archive of Chickens Lib, which were recently donated to Heritage Key Huddersfield in 2021. And they contain letters and campaign materials spanning from the early 1970s to 2017. This picture was taken in the archive and is a banner they used at one of their marches. I've also used a lot of newspaper sources where they appear there. So these sources provide an insight into grassroots protest and activism against the establishment and expansion of battery egg farming in the UK and the popular discourse surrounding it. They shed light on the moral and ethical drivers influencing a particular group of animal welfare activists in Britain, and they're also a valuable way to bring chickens into the story of eggs in post-war Britain, where previously eggs were abstracted from the hens that laid them. Chickens Lib forced the chicken back into the conversation. And just to situate the paper in the literature, recent scholarship has begun to uncover or recover the deep connections between women's history and animal welfare. So Emily Garda has highlighted the central role of women in animal advocacy and the overlapping struggles for women's and animal rights. In the 19th century context, Hilda Keane and Diana Donald showed how women played a vital yet often overlooked role in campaigns and organisations, as well as the central role of domesticity in the women's animal welfare activism. And Richard Ryder, who was a key figure in the RSPCA's radical movement in the 1970s, has written a retrospective on the changing attitudes of speciesism in Britain, arguing that the 1970s saw a resurgence in the thought and praxis of animal welfare in Britain. However, though he briefly mentions the work of Claire Druce of Chickens Lib and Ruth Harrison, who famously wrote Animal Machines, he doesn't fully explore the vital role of women in the animal rights movement in this period. And Karen Sayers' analysis of Ruth Harrison's Animal Machines, which was published in 1964, and the gendered responses it provoked, reveals how ideas of traditional and intensive farming were shaped by nostalgia and cultural anxiety. However, her argument does not extend beyond the end of the 1960s, so it doesn't consider the resurgence of animal welfare movement and the groups that put Harrison's ideas into practice. Klaus Kerschel has extended that story through a biography of Ruth Harrison, but his focus remains institutional rather than cultural. So my paper builds on this body of work to extend the history of eggs beyond the 1960s, situating them more clearly as an everyday food whose production and consumption both reflected and shaped the anxieties of 20th century Britain. But Chickens Lib weren't just a women's animal rights activist movement. They were also quite important in terms of situating rural food production into the urban environment. And the interdependence between the rural hinterland and the modern city, particularly in sustaining intensive agriculture, has been well established by historians, sociologists, and geographers. Chris Otter, for example, describes how the development of the vital modern city required a radical reconfiguration of animal geographies, pushing livestock out of sight and into the countryside. And by the late 20th century, as Catherine Oliver notes, urban livestock had become so spatially and socially distant that keeping hens in cities had become a middle-class pastime. Carolyn Steele pushes this idea further, observing that our rural hinterland will always mirror the way we live. If we're uncomfortable with what happens in those landscapes, she argues, we must rethink how we eat, because the city and its food systems are inseparable. So it's in this context that Chickens Lib can be seen as an early grassroots attempt to force urban consumers to confront the hidden costs of food. So the first time Chickens Lib's views and concerns were broadcast nationally was through their appearance on BBC Two's public access television programme, Open Door. The purpose of Open Door was to give members of the public editorial control over programmes related to their causes and concerns. Later described as Britain's most radical experiment in public access television, Open Door offered a platform to otherwise marginalised groups and voices. Chickens Lib's appearance gave the group a measure of institutional legitimacy and enabled them to reach a broader, more sympathetic public. In their episode, founders Violet Spalding, Claire Drews, and Vivian Jenkins were joined on screen by local actor Reg Johnson. The views expressed by Chickens Lib during their appearance on Open Door, that battery cage egg production was inhumane and unnecessary and served only the interests of a minority of businessmen, and was actively enabled by the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, remained consistent throughout their activism in the 1970s and 1980s. Their strategies in opposing battery cages were also evident in this episode. They drew attention to the suffering of battery hens by showing the poor condition of recently rehomed birds, and they sought to challenge the cultural association of eggs with comforting, uncritical domesticity. So the episode on Open Door opened with a scene in which a man reads the newspaper at the breakfast table. The wallpaper behind him suggests a domestic space. The chickens were not yet visible. Instead, there's an establishing shot of a normal breakfast, a boiled egg, a pot of tea, and a man reading a newspaper. This scene was representative of the imagery evoked in the 1960s to sell eggs to the British public. And this particular reminiscent of the Tony Hancock go to work on an egg advertisements, which became something of a cultural phenomenon in the 1960s. So the scene centres on the suited man who's presumably had his breakfast prepared for him and is following a stereotypical morning routine in a white British middle-class home. It's upon reading the newspaper that this idealised domesticity is inverted. So he says, let's see what's in the news. Ah, it's an article about hens kept in modern conditions. It's more like the Dark Ages. There's no natural daylight ever. Thousands die. What a disgusting list of diseases. Ah, I see. Antibiotics, zinc bacitracin, flavomycin. I think I'm going off the idea of this egg. He then pushes his breakfast egg away. In this short vignette, Chickens Lib attempted to complicate the perception, encouraged by advertisers, that associated eggs with normal domesticity. They argued that although eggs may appear wholesome and straightforward, a more critical examination reveals that when intensively produced, eggs are unhealthy, complex, and inhumane. Chickens Lib asserted that the unnatural conditions of the hens and the obtuse scientific names of the drugs given to them were incompatible with the wholesome domestic scene. The episode then cuts from the breakfast table to the three members of Chickens Lib sitting in a television show format. Violet Spalding, sat in the middle, reads, "Our man at breakfast has had a shock." In this juxtaposition, the women of Chickens Lib control the narrative, and it's the man who's perturbed. This was an inversion of a perception found in contemporary discourse on egg production and consumption. in which women were portrayed as ignorant of the necessary realities of modern livestock farming. Chickens Lib asserted that men, and men in power, could and should be shocked by the current state of egg production. So a significant aspect of Chickens Lib's appearance on Open Door was their effort to make egg-producing chickens visible to the urban public. They brought 2 recently rehomed battery hens onto the programme, both in an abject condition, with missing feathers and visible injuries, and displayed a 2-scale battery cage to demonstrate the cramped conditions in which such hens were kept. Chickens Lib confronted viewers with the lived reality of battery hens, making the suffering of the chickens tangible. Their Open Door episode juxtaposed the comforting imagery of a breakfast scene with the material conditions of its production. In the programme, Chickens Lib also criticised the profit makers in modern egg industry. They asserted that businessmen have got a monopoly of egg production in this country. They're not farmers and have no concern for their stock beyond profitability. Chickens Lib compared traditional family-oriented production with modern agriculture, which was made up, in their opinion, of scientists, businessmen, and politicians. This reflected shifts in the public perception of farmers in the post-war period. Once seen as stewards of the countryside, farmers were criticised by environmental movements, which argued that profit-driven motives had replaced their traditional role, reducing them to mere business operators. Chickens' perception of animal welfare was inextricably linked to their understanding of what a farm should be. This paralleled some consumer preferences for eggs in the 1960s and 70s, where ideas of freshness and taste were closely associated with pastoral farm imagery. Their critique of industrial agriculture's capitalist logic was further emphasised in Claire Drews's conclusion, where she argued that rather than promoting labour-saving battery systems, the government should encourage people, perhaps our unemployed school leavers, to return to the land. This idea resonated with the 1970s British Back to the Land movement, which linked organic farming and self-sufficiency to broader critiques of modernity and consumer capitalism. On Open Door, Chickens Lib's call to ban battery cages was inseparable from their vision of a more ethical, less profit-driven society. And Chickens Lib's criticism of dishonest advertising practices of egg producers continued beyond their appearance on Open Door. Egg adverts in the 1970s and 80s often linked them to the countryside or suggested they were farm fresh. Chickens Lib criticised the practice of producers who would like you to think your fresh farm eggs come from hens running free in the farmyard, rather than a battery cage. As part of their attack on egg adverts, Chickens Lib forced the government to confirm in writing that no government money was spent on egg advertisements by the British Egg Information Service in the 70s. And Chickens Lib wanted to break the connection between the nostalgic imagery of the countryside and eggs. They suggested that the reality of modern egg production was industrial, cruel, and unnatural, and they attempted to counter suggestions by producers and advertisers that eggs were linked to the countryside or traditional farms. For example, that this postcard contrasts the slogan, "Taste of the Country," with pictures of eggs behind bars. Similarly, in its video Hidden Suffering, Chickens Lib highlighted how consumers were misled by labels such as country fresh, with eggs sold in boxes adorned with idyllic farmhouses set among rolling meadows. And Golden Lay, a large production company, was the target of several Chickens Lib protests. In June 1981, they demonstrated out of Golden Lay's Wakefield headquarters, arguing that a recent television commercial, the one that was just seen previously, featuring 3 farmhands, was designed to mislead housewives into believing eggs came from traditional farms. At another protest in Scunthorpe, they objected to the misleading use of slogans to advertise eggs, as well as the unnecessary pain and distress of the battery system. They demanded that laying hens be able to enact natural practices, and they pushed for actual farm conditions to reflect the idyllic imagery used in advertising. Through these protests, Chickens Lib aimed to break the public's perception that eggs were produced using humane methods, while pressuring authorities to act against deceptive advertising. They frequently targeted trading standards, saying that this dishonest kind of promotion will continue to thrive as long as consumers are prepared to deceive themselves about how their eggs are produced. And one thing that I find kind of interesting about this, that I'm still exploring, is that Chickens Lib seems to be asking for chickens' lives to match the reality of industry-produced adverts, and that advertisers' imagery is shaping the ideals of welfare activists. So they wanted the chickens to have the idyllic existence represented in adverts by companies that they were opposing. So moving on to the wider scale of Chickens Lib's protests, public demos and stunts were integral to Chickens Lib, particularly in their early years, and it was through these activities that they gained the most press attention. And though they were non-violent, Chickens Lib were disruptive. A key facet of their activism in the 70s and 80s was bringing battery hens to demonstrations in the city and at centres of egg agribusiness. They did this to show the public the abject conditions of battery cages, their detrimental effects on hens' health, and to create an urban spectacle in their protest to gain attention. Unlike other livestock, chickens lent themselves to demonstrations because of their small size, high turnover, and low cost. And hens at the end of their lay were more likely to be in a poor state and emotionally impact the public who saw them. Hilda Keane has explored how animals being used as spectacles in previous women's political campaigns, and bringing live chickens to demonstrations also ties into the longer history of cities transforming animals into spectacles in zoos, circuses, and menageries. Chickens Lib could be seen to be inverting this trope by using the spectacle of the chicken to enact animal welfare change rather than displaying exotic animals for entertainment or science. And it ties into a wider movement in the 1970s where animals were also used in European protests. So Andrew Smith highlights the Larzac sheep protest in France, where French farmers were demonstrated against state land expropriation by herding sheep onto the land and blocking roads. The sheep, according to Smith, served as both objects and agents of resistance, symbolizing rural opposition to technocratic modernism. Similarly, Chickens Lib used live chickens to challenge the technocratic modernism underpinning battery farming. That unlike farmers who brought livestock to protest primarily to disrupt, Chickens Lib emphasized the suffering and poor physical conditions of battery hens to expose the ethical costs of their intensive production. These demonstrations were a confrontation between rural and urban spaces and a reminder of the hidden cruelty behind modern food systems. So the first mention of Chickens Lib protests in a newspaper was a report in The Guardian in June 1971 concerning a demonstration in Parliament Square, London. They brought 4 hens purchased from a battery farm the previous day and exhibited them in a 2-scale battery cage. The hens displayed in the demonstration visibly reflected the conditions of battery farms, and Chickens Lib aimed to inform urban consumers about the conditions faced by battery hens, challenging the romanticized view of rural idyll forwarded by advertisers and sometimes held unquestionably by consumers. James McWilliams argues that separating people from food-producing animals through urbanization, mechanization, and the decline in the agricultural workforce was a key feature of factory farms. This separation fosters emotional indifference towards their exploitation. Chickens Lib aim to reconnect consumers with the lived realities of food-producing animals. When protesting at the locations of key stakeholders in the egg industry, Chickens Lib connected political decisions to their welfare consequences, breaking down the divide between the economic choices made by agribusinesses and the government and the everyday injustices that animals were facing. So they would also frequently go directly to farms to purchase end-of-lay battery hens. But when they were based in London in the early 70s, they'd also visit markets in the East End to pick up end-of-lay chickens intended for slaughter. And these hens were often kept in highly unsanitary conditions. So they used hens purchased from the slaughter shop pictured here in the East End to protest against the Ministry of Agriculture offices in May 1973. And throughout the 70s and 80s, Chickens Lib were regularly bringing rescued battery chickens to public demos. And these demos targeted MAF offices, egg producers, supermarkets, and even Anglican church services. And they believed that the issue was the hiddenness of battery farming and that the realities of intensive agriculture were concealed from urban consumers. Things would change if the public could see the conditions in which battery hens were kept. A related tactic used by Chickens Lib was attending anti-factory farming demos with human-sized battery cages. And this type of demo, in which humans are imagined as exploited animals, has become a common feature of contemporary animal rights protests, commonly used by PETA. And the aim is to humanize chickens raised in battery cages and to draw an equivalence between the emotional lives of humans and animals. And the city space served as a vital conduit for Chickens Lib to disseminate their message. The human-sized battery cages represented both a reclamation of urban space for animals who had been made invisible, and also a commentary on the claustrophobic built environment of urban modernity. So these cages not only made the plight of battery hens more tangible, but also exposed unsettling parallels between the confinement of industrial agriculture and the constraints of contemporary urban life. They critiqued the cruelty of intensive farming and the alienation inherent in modern living. So the final section of this paper, which ties together Chickens Lib's protest actions and the moral framework, is the influence of Christian language and moral norms, which permeated much of their writings and actions. So although not an actively Christian group, Chickens Lib upheld a particular set of social values that they believed the church was betraying by remaining silent on intensive egg production. The question of morality was an essential concern for Chickens Lib throughout their years of activity. And the history of anti-animal cruelty movements in 19th century Britain was also inextricably tied to Christian messaging and ideals, with the RSPCA avowedly Christian in its early years. Similarly, as Klaus Kerschel has highlighted, Ruth Harrison's animal welfare activism was rooted in her Quaker beliefs and appreciation for nature and the countryside, in contrast to the industrialization of factory farming. So Chickens Lib's targeting of the church, therefore, arose out of a long-standing tradition of animal welfare activism. And according to Callum Brown, the 1960s marked a period of significant secularization in Britain, centered on women who'd previously been the bedrock of Christian organizing and community. However, as explored by Grace Davey and others, Christianity in the forms of customs, identities, and community understandings remained pervasive in Britain in this period. And these moral and social norms were central to the Chickens Lib's ideology and actions. They sent Christmas cards sized to match the space allocated to 5 battery hens, which was 18 inches by 20 inches, to figures like Agricultural Minister Michael Joplin, the royal family, and the director of M&S. And these also featured an image of a suffering battery hen. The Christmas card picture here is a more friendly version that they sent to their members. Unfortunately, I couldn't get hold of the battery hen-sized Christmas card, but I'd confirmed that that's what they did send. Claire Druce also wrote a carol titled A Christmas Carol for All God's Creatures, set to the tune of Away in a Manger, which was distributed to members to be sung at church services or schools. Though reading letters, I'm not sure how successful she was in getting this actually sung. Further to this, Chickens Lib organised Christian service at Sheffield Cathedral and on the 6th of October in 1982, titled Let There Be Light, Man's Responsibility to the Animal Kingdom. And though the service was explicitly Christian, they wanted to welcome all people. So in their newsletter to supporters, Chickens Lib argued that so many Christians are turning a blind eye on the fact, and that this therefore justified their protests at church services. So in October 1980, they disrupted a service at Wakefield Cathedral by bringing in 4 battery hens in a cage. The provost, a member of the RSPCA, forced them to leave and later remarked that their actions were more likely to alienate people than win sympathy. Spalding quoted a newspaper report on the incident saying, "We tried numerous ways to get church support and persuade them to show compassion, but they seem to have none." And the following year, also in October, at a harvest festival at York Minster, they dressed as nuns and brought end-of-life battery hens with deformed beaks, feet, and featherless wings to the church. And Spalding remarked, "They can't ignore the pathetic creatures in our cage, which we rescued last week." The stark contrast between the bird's condition and the idyllic imagery of the harvest festival underscored Chickens Lib's message. Their protest served multiple purposes: to push the Anglican Church to align its moral stance against battery farming, to evoke compassion from churchgoers, and to expose the ties between the agricultural establishment and the church. By highlighting the contradictions within British moral norms surrounding animal agriculture, Chickens Lib aligned themselves more closely with figures such as Ruth Harrison, the RSPCA, and rural tradition-based criticisms of factory farming, rather than the more radical animal liberationist groups which were emerging in the 1970s and 80s. So they weren't, in this sense, a radical organisation looking to build a new moral code, but one that pointed to inhumanity already visible within the moral and social values it believed the British public shared. And just to bring around to the conclusion. So Chickens Lib remains a largely overlooked but influential force in the history of British animal agriculture activism, particularly in relation to eggs. By staging demonstrations with live chickens, they confronted the urban public with the liveliness and material reality of animals at the heart of industrial farming. Rooted in welfare rather than abolition, their campaign appealed to a nostalgic vision of traditional agriculture over mechanized cruelty, revealing the hidden reality of the industrialized hinterland. Their protest and opposition to industrial egg production more generally was situated in societal moral norms of the period, from protesting the church and the royals to situating egg production within the context of other historical injustices. Their activism also drew attention to the spatial politics of food production. By highlighting the hidden lives of hens, they challenged urban consumers to consider the geographic and ethical distance between the sites of production and consumption, foregrounding how moral and material concerns traversed these boundaries. So I argue that Chickens Lib's legacy reveals how debates over food, morality, and modernity in 20th century Britain converged around one everyday object, the egg. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Joel. I'm just going to stop the recording for a moment.